Welcome to the Fuel Pulse Show podcast, where we talk about all things fuel for all kinds of people. I'm your host, Erik Bjornstad, and I'll be your guide today through that ever-changing world of fuel. So here at the Fuel Pulse Show podcast, we talk about important news and factors concerning the different kinds of fuel that we all have to use, both in our professional lives on the job and in our personal lives. Plus, we also talk about all the equipment and the systems and the things that use that fuel both in our professional lives and also the things that we use personally to make our lives easier. That means Fuel Pulse Show podcast is really for everyone. And so, what are we going to talk about on today's episode? Well, we're going to talk about something that gets discussed or always gets discussed about this time on the calendar each year. That is expectations for the upcoming Atlantic hurricane season. Hurricane season starts usually June the 1st, runs through November 30th. And before June, all through that first part of the year, we start getting predictions about whether we should expect the coming season to be good, bad, or ugly, and how much so. Now, so far this year, up through middle to late April, 4 organizations have so far weighed in with predictions about hurricane season, about what they think is going to happen. There is the organization known as Tropical Storm Risk. They did the first prediction back in December. Then they updated it with a new one later in April. We have Colorado State University. We have the University of Arizona. And we have North Carolina State University. All 3 of them had done predictions before and are fairly well regarded. So they all did their predictions on what we might expect for the 2025 Atlantic hurricane season to look like. Now, question that starts coming into our minds is, what does a typical hurricane season look like? And in order to describe a typical hurricane season, there are at least 3 elements, really 4 elements, that go into all hurricane season predictions that you're likely to see. So whether we're talking about how bad they're predicting a season to be, or we're looking back on past years and talking about what happened in those years storm-wise, we'll always reference these 3 to 4 things. Now, if you think about an average year, according to NOAA, which is the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, according to NOAA and also data from Colorado State University, between 1991 and 2020, so about 30 years there, the average hurricane season had 14 named storms, 7 hurricanes, and then 3 major hurricanes, major hurricane being category 3 or higher. And then there's a 4th thing that they mentioned. The average year would have an Accumulated Cyclone Energy Index, or ACE index, of between 70 and 110 units. We'll talk about what that means in a moment. Now keep in mind, when we say named storms, any storm that forms out in the Atlantic and gets above a certain strength is going to get a name. And a substantial number of named storms in every hurricane season, they never make it to the U.S. They may form out in the Atlantic, they may fizzle out in the Atlantic, or they may curve away from the United States, go somewhere else. Substantial number of named storms never actually make landfall. And so when we say the average season has 14 named storms, we're not talking about 14 storms hitting the south or east coast of the United States. Now, we mentioned this thing called an ACE index. What is the ACE index? Well, broadly speaking, this Accumulated Cyclone Energy Index, it's a way to express the total strength and duration of these tropical and subtropical storms that happen throughout a hurricane season. Now, what NOAA will do, when they're describing or classifying a hurricane season, they will default to looking primarily at the ACE value for that particular year. They may also mention the number of storms and major hurricanes, but really the ACE index for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration ACE value is really going to be the primary thing that they will point to when they say, for example, that 2022 was a below average year or 2024 was an above average hurricane season. Now, how do you calculate the ACE value? Because right now it doesn't mean anything to us. Well, the ACE value is calculated for each storm. And so for any particular storm, first thing they do is they wait until that storm exceeds the threshold for tropical storm strength, which is having sustained wind speeds of 39 miles an hour or higher. Once the storm reaches that, they'll start taking wind speed measurements, and they'll take measurements of a storm's maximum sustained wind speed at a given point in time, and they'll express that in knots. Now, you've heard knots, K-N-O-T-S. A knot is about 1.2 miles per hour. So think of if a storm has, if wind speed is 50 miles an hour, that's about 40 knots, give or take. Okay, so they take a measurement of the wind speed in knots. Then what they do is they square that and they divide by 10,000. Then they keep taking measurements every 6 hours until the storm drops or stops being at tropical storm strength. And then once the storm drops below that and essentially goes away, they'll add all those up and they'll say this is that storm's ACE index value. So let's take an example. Let's say that we have a moderate tropical storm, one that has the wind speeds of 45 knots, which we'll say for kicks is about 60 miles an hour. Okay. But it sustains those, they last for about 3 days, 72 hours. So we'll assume that that's 12 readings. Might be 13, but we'll say 12, okay? So they have 12 readings, and each reading, let's say it kept that wind speed 45 knots. So each reading would be 45 squared divided by 10,000, which if you got a calculator, you know what that number is. But basically, that's about 0.2 each reading. They had 12 readings. That means that when it's all said and done, that storm had an ACE index value of about 2.4, which isn't really that much. But remember, we weren't talking about a particularly powerful storm. So that's the ACE index, or how they calculate the ACE index for one storm. The total ACE index for a given hurricane season is a single number. That's all of the ACE indexes for all the storms that happened all added together. And so once you realize what it is, you realize that ACE index is pretty useful for reflecting not just how many storms occurred, but really how long the storms lasted for and how intense they were. It should be pretty easy to see that the ACE index reflects this, or confirms, makes us see that this idea that how bad a storm isn't just reflected in something like, well, what is its maximum wind speed? It really matters for saying how powerful a storm is. It really matters not just if the winds are strong, but how long they are strong for. Now, the highest ACE index for a given hurricane season in a year happened way back in 1933. It was 258.6. Now keep in mind though, 1933 was before they had weather satellites. And that means that in actuality, that year might have actually been worse than that, because there might have been any number of smaller storms that just didn't happen to get counted because they didn't have satellites keeping track of them. Let's go to a more recent couple of years that will be more meaningful to us. If you remember the years 2004 and 2005, when we had storm after major hurricane after storm just coming up and just pummeling the southern United States. 2005 had the second highest ACE index in recorded history, 250. And 2004, the year before it, was, I think, fifth highest all time. So those were pretty bad years, and the ACE index reflects that. Now, in terms of how powerful single storms are, the record holder is from a storm that happened way back in 1893. That has the single record, the single storm record for the highest ACE index. But Hurricane Ivan back in 2004, has the second highest one. It has an ACE index of over 70. Now, how did it get so high? Well, let's talk about some of Ivan's characteristics. Ivan was a storm that really combined really powerful winds, unusually powerful winds, that happened over an unusually long period of time. Ivan, as a storm, actually lasted for over 3 weeks. Had, at its peak, the max wind speeds for Ivan were 165 miles an hour, which I'm pretty sure makes it a Category 5. But more importantly, for compiling this high ACE index, it stayed as a major hurricane, that's Category 3 or higher, for 10 consecutive days, which is the longest time in recorded history. So those kinds of things are the things that you have to fall into place in order for you to end up with an ACE index as high as 70, which Ivan had. All right, so that's enough about the past. Let's talk about what are the predictions for the 2025 Atlantic hurricane season. So October 10th, the group Tropical Storm Risk released their extended range forecast for the 2025 season. They predicted what could be looked at as an average hurricane season. They said 15 named storms, 7 hurricanes, 3 major hurricanes. Now, they did note that this forecast that they were coming out with first had, as they put it, higher than normal uncertainty due to, well, any number of things, including the fact that it's the one furthest in the path, furthest away from events. Go to beginning of April, we typically expect to start seeing more forecasts. And so Colorado State releases its forecast on April 3rd. They predict an above average hurricane season. 17 named storms, 9 hurricanes, 4 major hurricanes. And unlike the Tropical Storm Group, Colorado State made an ACE index prediction. They said, we predict 155. Now, 155 is substantially higher than the average season. You remember 70 to 110 would be about average. And the reason that they cited that is they said there's going to be warm Atlantic sea temperatures, and the La Nina system that's been present out in the Pacific is going to weaken and essentially go away, become neutral by summer. And so those things are going to contribute to having a more active hurricane season. So that's Colorado State. 4 days later, TSR, the Tropical Storm Risk Group, updates their forecast. But they double down on predicting a near average season. Okay, so 2 groups, one predicting above average, one predicting about average. University of Arizona chimes in. They post their forecast. They're calling for a normal hurricane season. 15 named storms, 7 hurricanes, 3 major hurricanes, and they predict an ACE index of 110, which is about normal. So all told, when you look at the consensus, including whatever NC State predicted, the consensus so far is they're predicting 15 named storms, 7 to 8 hurricanes, 3 major hurricanes, which means about a normal hurricane season. Now, the ACE predictions, on the other hand, have a little bit more variance. Remember, Arizona State predicted 110 units. Colorado State predicted 155 units, which is 25% above average. And then there were a couple other predictions that slotted in between those. Why is there so much difference in those predictions? Well, it appears to come down to how much effect that a particular group thinks the sea surface temperatures are going to have in the upcoming season. See, Colorado State is basing their prediction of an ACE index of 155. They're predicting it on, or basing it rather, on the assumption that the water temperatures on the sea surface are going to be warmer than usual. Now, if they're right about that, their prediction's a lot more likely to be closer to what's going to happen, because warmer sea temperatures are a big driver of hurricane storm activity. Now, by contrast, Tropical Storm Risk, they happen to think that the sea surface temperatures aren't going to be that much warmer than usual. They think that the sea surface temperatures are going to be pretty normal. which is why they predict an ACE index much closer to the historical average. Now, so that's the predictions for 2025. How do those compare to the activity we've seen from the past few years? If we ask that question, we can start to put this into a little bit of perspective. So last year, 2024 season was actually more active than usual, and that's exactly what they predicted it was going to be at the start. We ended up having 18 named storms, we ended up having 11 hurricanes, and we had 5 major hurricanes. The predictions were 20 named storms, 11 hurricanes, 5 major ones. So you see, overall, the reality, the predictions weren't that far off of the reality. 2024 also, the ACE index for 2024 ended up being 161.6, 161. That places 2024 really firmly into the above average year category. 161 for an ACE index actually puts last year around, I think it's 16. So firmly in the top 20 all time for busiest Atlantic hurricane seasons. Now, what made 2024 so busy? Well, I know people have short memories, so we'll recite some names. 2024 had at least 3 significant storms that really contributed to that elevated ACE index. There was, if you remember, there's Hurricane Beryl, Hurricane Milton, Hurricane Kirk. These are pretty big storms, both in strength and duration. And you may have forgotten, but Hurricane Beryl was actually the earliest Category 5 hurricane on record in the Atlantic that they found. So, summary, what should we expect for the upcoming 2025 Atlantic hurricane season? And then later, we're going to talk about what does that tell us, or does that tell us anything about what we should be doing to prepare for that? Well, the predictions are it's not going to be a quiet season. It may not end up being as busy or as bad as the seasons were in 2017 or 2024, much less, 2004, 2005, all of which were, shall we say, historically active hurricane seasons. But the predictions are pretty much in consensus that 2025 is likely not going to be coming in like a lamb either, like 2015 or 2022, which were years that were unusually quiet in terms of hurricane activity. And so that's going to do it for this episode of the Fuel Pulse Show podcast. What we're going to do in the next episode is we're going to piggyback off of this. And we're going to talk about, now that we know what we might expect in terms of activity for this hurricane season, we want to ask the question, what should that lead us to do in response? How should we prepare for hurricane season, especially if we're in, let's say, the hospital and healthcare industry or the telecom industry, which are 2 industries that customers really rely on services being available and having 0 interruptions whatsoever. And that means that it's really important for these groups to have viable emergency backup systems, including emergency backup fuel that helps them get through a hurricane season without any disruptions to their customers. So we'll talk about what some of the recommendations are going to be for those sectors specifically as well. So we'll talk about that in the next episode of the Fuel Pulse Show podcast. In the meantime, thank you for joining me today. As usual, we will have links to everything that we talked about in the show notes. And if you haven't already, feel free to subscribe to the Fuel Pulse Show podcast on your podcast platform of choice, be it iTunes, Amazon Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, wherever you most prefer to get your podcast information from. Feel free to subscribe. Leave us a good rating if you feel so inclined, because that's also something that is helpful for people finding us as well. So, till next time, I am your host, Erik Bjornstad, and I will see you next time for the next episode of the Fuel Pulse Show podcast.